안내
I would
말씀드리겠습니다.
like
이제
to
곧
make some housekeeping
행사를
announcements.
시작을 할
We're soon
텐데요.
going to start the
이제 마침
event.
박영우 장관님도
And the
오셨고 해서
minister
행사 시작하기 전에
Park
앞에
has just
기념
arrived,
촬영을
and
먼저
so
하고
we're going to take
진행하도록
a group
하겠습니다.
commemorative photo
장관님이야
first.
내빈
So
분들과
I'd like
발표
to ask the
토론자께서는 앞으로 나와
minister,
주시면
the
고맙겠습니다.
speakers, and the moderators to come forward and stand on the stage.
Participants who are online, please look at the camera or at the camera attached to your terminal, your laptops, so that it looks like you are looking at the camera for the photo op.
예, 시간이 되었기 때문에
Yes, it's time
시작하도록
for us to
하겠습니다.
start.
지금부터
We're
한일
now
관계
going to
국제
start
포럼
the Global
인류
Forum on
공동의
Korea-Japan
기업,
relations, humanities
유네스코
collective memories,
세계문화유산
UNESCO World Heritage and Trust
국제사회의
in
신뢰
international
포럼을
relations.
시작하도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 오늘 이
First and
행사를
foremost,
주최하는
I would
아시아 평화
like
역사연구소
to
이사장님
invite Mr.
안병우
Byung-ho An, who is the
이사장님으로부터
Chief Director of the
개회사가
Asia Peace and
있겠습니다.
History Institute, which is the host of today's event.
네, 안녕하십니까. 아시아
Good
평화
afternoon.
역사연구소
I'm
안병우입니다.
Chief Director An Byung-woo of the Asia Peace and History Institute. I am pleased to invite all of you to the International Forum, Humanities Collective Memories, UNESCO World Heritage and Trust in International Relations. In 2015, Japan applied for the registration of its modern industrial facilities on the list of UNESCO World Cultural Heritage.
태평양 전쟁 당시에
Japan forced Koreans, Chinese,
조선인과
and prisoners of war from Allied forces to work against their will in these facilities and sites during the Pacific War.
세계문화유산 등재 과정에서
And in the process of inscription on the UNESCO's World Heritage
본인의
list,
의사에
Japan
반하여
already admitted
강제로
to the
노역했다는
forced
사실을
conscription of so many
인정했습니다.
victims, including
그리고
Koreans, against their will,
희생자들을 기리는
and pledged
정보센터를
to set up an
설치하겠다고
information center to
약속했습니다.
commemorate these victims.
그렇지만 올해
However,
6월 15일 도쿄에
in
개관한
June of this year,
산업유산정보센터에는
the Industrial Heritage
강제노동
Information Center that was set up
기리는
in
내용은
Tokyo,
이것은
there was
일본이
no effort
유네스코
at all to
세계유산위원회
pay tribute
회원국들에게
to the victims
공개적으로
as
했던
promised.
약속을
Such
어기는
behavior
것이고
of Japan contradicts its
국제사회의
earlier
신뢰를
pledge that it will
저버린
publicly
행위입니다.
make that it publicly made to the
배경에서
member countries of the
저희
UNESCO
아시아
World Heritage
평화와
Committee
역사연구소는
and is undermining the trust
유네스코
of the international
세계문화유산이
community.
추구해야 할
Against this
인류의
backdrop,
보편적
the Asia
가치의
Peace
의미를
and History Institute
살펴보면서
organized this
일본이
forum to share
과거를
insights on
반성하고
what are the universal human
국제사회에
values that
약속한 대로
UNESCO World Heritage needs to
희생자의
pursue,
아픔도
while
온전히
urging Japan
기록하도록
to reflect on
촉구하기
its
위한
past wrongs
논의의
and
장을
record the
마련했습니다.
truth about the pain
여러분들의
of victims
적극적인
as it
관심과
pledged to the
참여를
international community.
부탁드리겠습니다.
I would like to ask
감사합니다.
for your active participation and support. Thank you.
예, 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much.
다음은
Next, I would
오늘
like
이
to
행사를 후원해 주신
invite
문화체육관광부
the Minister of Culture, Sports and Tourism, Mr. Yang Woo Park.
입니다만은 이 후원
The ministry
후원을 대표해서
is the government
문화체육관광부
organization
박양무
that has
장관님께서
sponsored
축사를
today's global
해주시겠습니다.
forum.
네, 여러분 안녕하세요.
Good afternoon,
문화체육관광부
everyone.
장관
I'm the
박양무입니다.
Minister of Culture, Sports and
어려운
Tourism,
상황에도
Yang
불구하고
Park. Thank you for being with
태평양
us
전쟁 당시 자행되었던
despite the difficult
강제 노동의
circumstances.
진실을 밝히고
I would like
일본의
to
역사 왜곡을 바로잡기
extend
위한
my
장을
deepest
마련해 주신
appreciation to Dr.
아시아 평화와
An
역사
Byung-woo, the Chief
연구소
Director of the Asia Peace and
안병우
History Institute,
이사장님과
for preparing this forum
관계자 여러분,
despite the difficult
그리고
circumstances we face
온라인을
today.
통해서
The forum
참석해
aims to
주신
reveal the truth behind
국내외
Japan's use of
시민단체와
forced labor
학계
and its distortions
전문가
of
여러분,
history. And I would also like to
감사의
thank all the
말씀드립니다.
experts who are here
전 세계가
through
코로나19로
online
고통을 받고
platform.
있습니다.
The entire world
그
is
어느
suffering from the
때보다도
COVID-19. It is
국가
now
간,
more
공동체가,
urgent than ever
개인 간
for countries,
협력과
communities,
연대가
and individuals
절실히
to forge
필요한
solidarity.
시기입니다. 저는 협력의 다른
If
말이
there's a
있다면
synonym for
그것은
cooperation, I'd
신뢰라고
say it's
생각합니다.
trust.
오직
Only
신뢰를
trust can
통해서만
move us
진정한
towards genuine
연대의 관계로
solidarity.
나아갈 수 있습니다. 신뢰는
And
정직하고
trust stems
진실한
from honesty and
태도에서
sincerity.
비롯합니다. 태평양 전쟁
During
당시
the Pacific War,
일본과 한국은
Japan and Korea
가해국과
were in a
피해국의
perpetrator-victim relationship.
한국뿐만 아니라
Korea and
아시아의
many
다른
other
국가들도
Asian countries
피해를
fell victim.
이는 역사에
Though
기록된
this is an
명백한 사실입니다.
indisputable historical
과연
fact,
일본이
I'm not sure whether
피해국들의
Japan
희생자들에게
earnestly
진심으로
relates to the
공감하고
victims
있는지
in these
묻고
affected
싶습니다.
countries.
일본이
In
아시아
order to
피해국들의
gain
신뢰를
the
얻고
trust of the victim
그
countries
국가들과
and to
진정한
truly
협력과
cooperate and forge
연대를
solidarity
하기
with them,
위해서는 잘못을
Japan
반성하고
needs to reflect
사과하는
on
모습을
and
반드시
apologize
보여줘야
for its past wrongdoings.
2015년
In
일본은
2015,
메이지 근대
Japan
산업시설을
applied to have its sites
유네스코
of the Meiji
세계문화유산으로
Industrial Revolution inscribed
등재
as a
신청했습니다.
UNESCO World Heritage.
해당 시설은
These sites
태평양
were the
전쟁
very
당시
places where
일본이
during the Pacific War,
조선인, 중국인,
Japan had
연합군
forced
전쟁포로
Koreans, Chinese
일본인
POWs from
노동자까지
Allied forces
강제
and
노동을
Japanese
시켰던 장소.
workers to work against their will.
특히 구남도는
In particular,
수많은
the
조선인이
Hashima, the battleship island,
해저
is a
1000m 아래의
controversial place
탄광
where
갱도
many
안에서
Koreans were forced to
적게는
work at
하루
least
12시간
12 or even
많게는 16시간
16
동안
hours per day in a
석탄을
coal mine
채우다가
located 1,000 meters below sea level.
상상할 수 없이
They had to
가혹하고
endure cruel
참혹한
and
시간을
unimaginably
보냈습니다.
miserable conditions there.
세계 유산
During
등재
the UNESCO
과정에서
World Heritage
일본 스스로도
inscription registration
한국인을
process,
비롯한
Japan admitted that
각국의 포로
Koreans
등이
and many
본인
POWs
의사에
from other
반하여
countries had
강제로
undergone
노역했다는 사실을
forced labor.
인정했습니다.
They were forced to work
희생자들을
and
기리는
vowed to set up an
정보센터를
information center to
설치하겠다고
commemorate these
약속했습니다.
victims.
하지만
However,
약속은
Japan
제대로
failed to
지켜지지
abide by its
않았습니다.
pledge.
지난 3월
The Industrial
도쿄에
Heritage
개관한
Information Center
산업유산정보센터에는
that recently opened in
메이지
Tokyo
산업혁명을
displays
기념하고
exhibitions that
이를
only
널리 알리는
promote and
전시물이
commemorate
있을
the Meiji
뿐입니다.
Industrial Revolution,
희생자를
and none
추모하고
that pays
위로하려는
tribute to
노력은
the victims.
오히려
The center
한
even
방금
displays
차별 대우를
biased
받는
testimony claiming that there was no discrimination against Korean workers.
일본은 유네스코
Such behavior by Japan contradicts its earlier public pledge to the member countries of the UNESCO World Heritage Committee and undermines the trust of the international community. The country is distorting historical facts and reopening the victims' old wounds. The purpose of the UNESCO World Heritage is to preserve sites that hold outstanding universal value for humanity. The values that humanity must preserve are not just those that are tangible and visible. We also need to protect the spiritual values embedded in the heritage, even if they reveal a shameful, dark past. In 2001, the Zollverein coal mine industrial complex in the city of Essen in Germany was inscribed into the UNESCO World Heritage. This coal mine has a similar history to the history of the battleship Ireland. Germany, however, demonstrated its courage by admitting that its Nazi regime had forcibly mobilized workers and revealed relevant facts as accurately as possible. If Japan continues to betray its pledge to the international community and denies the facts of forced labor on Battleship Ireland, then Japan is undermining the spirit and mission of the UNESCO World Heritage. Total history comes only from honesty. Japan needs to not only commemorate its commendable industrial revolution, but also to acknowledge its dark history and the pain suffered by the victims. I sincerely hope that Japan will gather the courage to acknowledge its shameful history and the pain of the victimized nations, so as to pave the path for the future of Korea-Japan relations and for peace of Asia. Only then will we be able to depart from a relationship of perpetrator-victim and go towards one of genuine cooperation and solidarity. Today's forum is aimed to urge Japan to take responsibility as a UNESCO member state and to make efforts to earn the trust from countries that fell victim during the Pacific War. I hope that today's discussion will serve as an opportunity to remember the pain of people who are forced to work and to reflect upon the universal human values that a UNESCO World Heritage Site should possess. Once again, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to all those who are at the forefront of setting distorted history right and remembering the stories of the victims. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Next, despite the coronavirus pandemic, I'd like to, there's many people who have come to attend this conference, and I'd like to introduce some of them. First of all, Mr. Chu Jin-ho from the History Museum, and Mr. Kim Chul-min from the Korea Center and International Culture and International Service. And Mr. Nam Sang-gu from the Northeast Asia History Institute. Please understand that I will not be able to introduce more of the VIPs because of time constraints. And before we begin, I'd like to make some housekeeping announcements. When you're seated, unless you're speaking, please keep your face masks on. And if you have not had your temperature taken, please do so on your way in, at the reception desk on your way in. And just to test the linkage to see if we are networked, let me introduce the participants from abroad. We have 2 Japanese speakers and 1 from Australia and also from the United States. We have Mr. Yano Hideki, the Secretary General of the Joint Action for Resolution of the Forced Labor Issue and Settlement of Past Issues. Mr. Yano Hideki, thank you very much for coming. And we also have from Japan, Mr. Masuno Akihisa, who's a professor of Osaka School of International Public Policy. And from the Graduate Institute of Building and Planning of the National Taiwan University, we have Professor Hwang Shu-mei. Thank you very much for attending.
예, 그리고 호주 국립대 연구 책임 교수로 계신 로런 리처드
And we also have Professor Lauren Richardson from Australia, the Australian National University. She's the Director of Studies and Lecturer at this university. And because of the coronavirus pandemic, we have a lot of obstacles to cross, but sometimes this virus attack brings us closer together and propels us to find better ways to communicate and to exchange opinions. And I hope that this will serve in reaching a consensus on the issue at hand. We also have a keynote video or opening video entitled Courage to Face the Truth that was produced by the Korean Culture and Information Service. Please watch this video before we begin the program for today.
Yes, without further ado, let's start off with the first presentation.
프로그램 보시면 아시겠지만
So, if you look at the program, you can see that we have many speakers today,
시간은 짧고
but unfortunately, we don't have that much time, so we need to be as efficient as possible.
시간은 전혀 없어가지고
And so, yeah, some speakers have time explaining here, monitor. Yeah.
최대한 10분
So yes, please try to keep within your 10-minute limit. And there's actually a short break time because we need to shift around the ideas a little bit.
먼저 첫 번째 발표
So first, let's go to the first presentation. I'd like to invite the Secretary General for Joint Action for Resolution of the Forced Liberation of Past Issues, Hideki. So channel 1 is Korean, 2 is English, 3 is Japanese on your interpretation receivers.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm presenting this paper from Japan. My name is Yano Hideki. On the 31st of June, I went personally to the Industrial Heritage Information Center, and I think the participants at the symposium today, there are not that many people who have actually gone to see the place for themselves. So I will talk about that personal experience. And during the opening ceremony, some of the speeches made during the opening ceremony has already mentioned this. But the Meiji Japan Industrial Revolution heritage was listed in July 2015 as part of the World Heritage List. And some of the Japanese government made some promises during that time. Those were the conditions for its registration as a World Heritage Site. And the Meiji period was designated from 1850 to 1910, which is the industrial modernization period. And I think it was to beautify or to glorify this period as the Industrial Revolution of Japan. But the historical facts such as forced labor or forced people such as Koreans and Chinese and other nationals who were forced to forcefully mobilized to work in these sites, that historical fact was deleted. And then and it was considered irrelevant. However, ICOMOS, the International Conference on Monuments and Ruins, advised the Japanese government to make it make an exhibition strategy that can be understood as so that people can understand the entire history of each site. And the Japanese government announced that it would accept this condition, and so the registration was decided in 2015. And then in 2015, July 5th, upon registration as a World Heritage Site, the government of Japan made the following statement. It said that the Japanese government respects ICOMOS's recommendations derived from technical and professional points of view, in particular when formulating an exhibition or explanatory strategy. The recommendation was to make it possible to understand the entire history of each site. And so it will sincerely respond to this. At some sites in the 1940s, many people from the Korean peninsula were brought against their will and forced to work under harsh conditions, and will take steps to make people understand what was happening then. And the Japanese government will be implementing that. The Japanese government was implementing a conscription policy during World War II. We will explain this and make it part of the commentary. So these were the promises that the Japanese government made. So how were these fulfilled? I will talk about that next. From 2015, the Japanese government, 2 years from then, on November 30th of 2017, the Japanese government submitted a conservation status report to the World Heritage Committee. In this context, the interpretation of the story of industrial workers based on the assumption that Japan will focus on number 3, outstanding universal value, focuses on Japanese industrial workers during that period, and the fact that the Japanese government implemented a system for workers under the National Mobilization Act during World War II. But the expression of conscripted was changed. Conscripted or mobilized was changed to mean apply to go work in those sites. And there was also the promise to conduct a survey on the workers who were working on those sites back then, but this survey was entrusted to not a academic institution or group, but a non-academic group called the National Congress for Industrial Heritage, which is not an academic research organization. So the citizens of Japan and South Korea protested this Japanese government response and action, and submitted a written opinion to ICOMOS regarding this, to taking issue with this. And so in response, ICOMOS and the World Heritage Committee actually provided the following recommendations to the Japanese government. First of all, to urge states to take into account international best practices on interpretation strategies in continuing to work on interpretation and digital interpretation materials for the entire history of the sites or assets, including those covered by OUV and other periods. And the group that was conducting the survey was the National Congress of Industrial Heritage, and the Japanese civic groups requested the disclosure of the results of the survey conducted by the National Congress of Industrial Heritage, but the Congress and the Japanese government refused to disclose the contents of the survey. And the Japanese government also refused to engage in dialogue with the stakeholders, such as the victims of forced mobilization. And in this process, it was after this kind of process that the Industrial Heritage Information Center was opened on March 31st this year. The center should have originally been intended to fulfill its commitment, the Japanese government's commitment, to include in the explanatory or exhibition strategy the measures necessary to keep the victims in memory. However, the center was established in Tokyo by Kato Hikoko, but this person has been known to say outright that there was no enforced mobilization, forced mobilization. And the commentator also sometimes says to the visitors to the center that the Koreans are sloppy and they're always lying and so on. So the center's exhibits are meant to distort history rather than explain history properly. And if you look at the exhibits themselves, there are a lot of problems. For example, the Hashima or Battleship Island, regarding the island, the exhibit denies any forced laborers, and there were people taken from there to work in the Nagasaki shipyard, the Hashima coal mine, and the Mitsubishi heavy industries, and so on. But they say that they were mobilized under the national mobilization policy, and that there was no discrimination against the Korean workers. And so they only adopted the testimonies of the former islanders who claim that there was no forced labor, that there was no discrimination, and everyone lived in harmony. So that was the only side of the viewpoint that was adopted and exhibited at the information center. And also, there was total neglect to mention any other people who were forced to work there besides the Koreans, such as Chinese. There were about 2,500 islanders, Chinese, and there were some 8,000 people, the prisoners of war, and some of them Americans, who were there too. But their existence was totally deleted from the exhibits. And some of the documents that mention the forced mobilization and was not exhibited at all, such as administrative documents and official documents from the government consulate located in Korea, and so on. And these were not included in a database. And there was some. My group, the group that I belong to, has already submitted a commentary criticizing this lack of effort on the part of the Japanese government and the information center to correctly exhibit and explain the history of the Industrial Revolution, the Meiji Industrial Revolution. And we will be requesting for improvement, and it will be submitted soon. Thank you very much. Thank you for this very lively commentary on this, on your visit, personal visit to the information center, and and I would like to thank you for your continued efforts from a long time ago.
So the second presenter is Professor Huang Su-mei, who's the assistant professor at the National Taiwan University. Please go ahead.
벌써 두 번째로 넘어간 것 같은데요. 안 들리시는 거죠 지금? 네, 지금 소리.
Yes, we're not getting the sound. Professor Huang Su-mei, please unmute yourself. We are not hearing you. We do not hear you, Professor Huang Su-mei. Please unmute yourself. Please turn off your mute. You are muted, I think. We cannot hear you.
아직 안 들리는 거죠?
Yeah, we do not hear you.
코로나 시대에 아직 할 일이 많은 것 같습니다.
Yes, yeah, we still need some improvement in technology for us to overcome communication in this COVID-19 era.
들리는 걸 확인하고 발표를 시작해 주시죠.
We are not hearing you. We still do not hear you.
마이크를 켜주시면.
Please maybe turn on your mic Or maybe unmute yourself.
황 선생님 컴퓨터에
Professor Huang Shumei, perhaps your computer itself is muted? Could you please check if your computer itself is muted? We're still not getting your voice. We are not getting your voice.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we do hear you. We hear you. Yes, we hear you. Okay, please go ahead.
Professor Huang, you may go ahead. Please start from the beginning because you were on mute from the beginning.
From you.
들리지가 않습니다. 저는 그쪽 목소리가 들리지가 않습니다.
Is it
Please choose English in your Zoom.
그 사이에
Perhaps you could just start your presentation first. You can just start your presentation. Yeah. 잘 들립니다. 이제 잘 들립니다. Yes, we hear you. We hear you. Please go ahead with the presentation.
to should I go on to present?
Yes, please go ahead.
So sorry for delay.
지연되어서 죄송합니다.
So sorry for the delay. Again, Shumei from National Taiwan University. Here is the content of my presentation. I will talk about how remembering is an ongoing process. It's about disputing, it's about listening, valuing, and knowing the past and reenacting the past. First, starting from this most recent case of Hagia Sophia, I would like to bring your attention to the fact that disputes over heritage is definitely not limited to Korea and Japan. It can even occur within one nation states when there is regime changes. And we all know that the case of Hagia Sophia was once a symbol of secularization of Turkey. It was converted into a museum in 1935 under the founder of the Turkish Republic, Atatürk. Starting from last year and then becoming a truce this year, the incumbent president of Turkey turned it into a mosque. And actually the first Muslim prayer already happened last week. And we mostly all know that the Director General of UNESCO already sent deep regrets over the decision made. And here with this case, I would like to emphasize that heritage is about dialogue. We need dialogue for heritage making, and heritage making can enhance or worsen dialogues. Then the second part is about the politics of listing, valuing, and preservation. And I would like to argue that the politics of heritage is inevitably everywhere within the system of authorized heritage. What can we do to overcome its bias and violence is to recognize it and be honestly responsible for it. While most state members of the United States are paying attention to the competition over listing, and to be able to do so, spend much time about valuing the significance of their heritage, we pay much less attention to preservation, especially after listing, like the case of the sites of Meiji Industrial Revolution. Preservation is an ongoing, never-ending process of inheritance, conversation, and cross-border, cross-generation conversation. And actually, UNESCO has tried to respond to these highlights in its recent changes, recent updates. For example, according to Budapest Declaration on World Heritage in 2002, we can see how there has been a highlight about the listing, a balanced and credible World Heritage listing should increase public awareness, involvement, and support for World Heritage through communication. And again, here we can see the focus is on communication, conversation, and dialogue. We all are familiar with this operation of outstanding universal value as criteria, and especially for the first to the sixth are for the cultural heritage listing. But to deepen our understanding of authenticity as a key concept of outstanding universal values, it's important to pay attention to what's being issued along with the NARA documents on authenticity. The meaning of cultural heritage has accumulated over time. So the fact that the meaning will accumulate it over time, and it would be problematic then to strategically periodize the value of cultural heritage, as we can see in the case of sites of Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution, which was already introduced by earlier presenter. So I will skip some of the basic information here, but here I would like to bring your attention again to the periodization of the case from 1850s to 1910. The issue of periodization and thereof selective remembering is clearly reflected in this chart, which is adopted from the official website of the Meiji Industrial Revolution website. And I'm sure, although I haven't been there, but this chart is probably also shown in the information center in Tokyo. And here we can see how by area, we can see the case of Hashima Komai is located in the area of Nagasaki, grouped together with other cases like the Gulliver House and office that I will soon talk about. So here is what you can see when you visit Nagasaki, like I did in January 2019. When most visitors probably cannot make it to Hashima Island due to the restrictions of weather, most people will stop by Gulliver House, but there you have the beautiful view of the harbor, beautiful garden, beautiful houses with really nearly no information about the issue of forced labor. It's such a pity that people who stop by there without going to Hashima Island, they can hardly relate the site and its significance to other aspects of history. And if we carry on my earlier point about how meaning of cultural heritage is accumulated over time, then the criteria adopted for the listing of this case became problematic. So then how can we talk about these interchange of human values over a span of time? Or how can we talk about cultural tradition or civilization within limited time frame? By leaving out the years following 1910, the issues of colonialism and forced labor are then removed. So in response, UNESCO has already issued some new revisions that intended to encourage more conversation. So here we can see how what UNESCO learned from the case of sites of Meiji Industrial Revolution is to encourage more conversation beforehand and encourage state parties to refrain from including on their tentative list sites that would potentially raise issue. And there should be more constructive dialogue before the submission. So here, I would like to conclude with my final notes. Again, the politics of heritage is inevitably everywhere within the system, but what can we do to overcome its bias and violence for the benefit of our next generation is to recognize it and be honestly responsible for it. Thank you very much, and sorry again for the technical issue.
진실성 있게, 진정성 있게 이 문제를 접근해야 한다는 것을 다시 한번 강조하면서 마치겠습니다.
황 교수님,
Thank you, Professor Huang. This issue, or the issue of collective memory and the heritization, will always cannot be helped but be a political affair, and I think you have, given the time constraints, been quite frank and comprehensive in your presentation. We will take a short break, but actually we used up all our break time, so please stay on the venue and stay in front of your laptops, and we will begin part 2 shortly.
것입니다. 걱정하지 마시고.
We're soon going to start. Please come back to your seats.
예, 들어오시고 저기
I would like to ask all the participants to come back inside because we're going to start soon. And Professor Minter Kim, please take your seat here in the front.
예, 자리로 돌아주시면
I would like to ask all the participants to come back to your seats. We're soon going to start.
네, 그러면 회의를 속개하도록 하겠습니다. 이 화면
We're going to start once again. Please change the screen.
화면 회의 화면으로 예.
Yes, let's start the meeting once again. The third presentation is going to be made by
김민철
Professor Minter Kim, who's a professor of Gyeonggi University.
운영위원장, 한국 측 운영위원장을 맡고
He's also a member of the joint action regarding the forced labor, so he has been very much involved regarding the history issue between the two countries.
교수님의 발표를 청해 듣도록 하겠습니다.
So let's welcome Mr. Kim, Professor Kim.
예. 예, 발표는 앞에 나와서
Yes, Professor Kim, would you like to come forward and take your seat on the podium?
그러면 이 PPT를 통역자에게 저기 전송을 해주시기 바랍니다.
Yes, the PowerPoint presentations have not been delivered to the interpreters, so can we get that delivered?
우선 자료집 참고를 하고 시작.
Okay, so perhaps, yes, we can look at the program book first. So if you look at page 22 of the conference proceedings, or actually that's the abstract, on page 57 you can read his entire paper. So please go ahead, Professor Kim. So my name is Minter Kim. I will be making the third presentation. So I have just 10 minutes, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. So yes, a lot of the contents between the presenters are overlapping, and so there are some aspects of my presentation that overlaps with Mr. Yano Hideki's presentation, so I'll just skip those parts and go on to some other aspects. So basically the title of my presentation is What is Japan trying to say with the sites of its major industrial revolution? So I'll just share my thoughts about this particular question, or perhaps I'll try to answer this question. So in Tokyo in June, I heard that the Industrial Heritage Information Center opened, and the first thought that came to my head was that the Japanese government does not think about its pledges. So why is it doing what it's doing? I think it is because the Japanese government feels a sense of crisis because it's losing its hegemony. Also, Abe is leading history revisionism, and also it is trying to galvanize its domestic support by attacking Korea. And so many of the history revisionists in Japan have criticized the existing history as Comintern-centered historiography or Tokyo trial-centered historiography. And so it has already been about 20 years since the Japanese right wing have started to change the contents of the history textbooks. And so basically, the right wingers in Japan are trying to do all of this in order to strengthen its military and ultimately aim for revision of its constitution. And the Abe government has now promoted the inscription of the Meiji Industrial Revolution, including the battleship Island, and it is basically a part of the Japan's attempt to create the Ultra Nippon. So basically, it's emphasizing its great Japanese history and also try to drive the Japanese society to become more conservative. And so it has now chosen the Meiji Industrial Revolution, which drove the industrialization of Japan and modernization of Japan to actually contribute to this kind of right-wing efforts. But then it ran into a barrier. This is because in Korea, the Supreme Court ruled that the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Nippon Steel were indeed perpetrators of forced labor and ruled against those companies. And so basically the Korean ruling had basically denied the so-called 1964 regime, and also has said that the 65 agreement on settlement and claims between Korea and Japan are very much limited and does not deal or does not compensate for the forced labor. And so basically, this is quite similar to the Holocaust deniers. The Japanese right wing is basically denying the forced labor that had taken place. And you can see this in that information center that opened in June this year. So this is basically like a secondary victimization, basically. It's far from healing the wounds of the victims. And it is an action that basically blocks any road to peace and cooperation. And so it's basically it's a history distortion center, not an industrial heritage information center. So this is the kind of criticism that has been raised against the center after it opened. Anyway, so this is what came to my head when I witnessed the opening. And so I'd like to now go on to the World Heritage Committee and some of the decisions and the recommendations made at the UNESCO. And so and I think I'll skip most of this parts regarding the UNESCO, because it's repetitive with some of the other presenters. So I'll just go on to some of the implications of the report. Anyway, my suggestion was basically that the Industrial Heritage Information Center should be transformed into a new kind of center that brings together all the stakeholders in East Asia and promotes peace together. So actually, it was foreseeable because the National Congress on Industrial Heritage, which took on the role of collecting the data, had already started to selectively interpret this Meiji Industrial Revolution. Well, there were indeed testimonies by the citizens around the Hashima Island saying that there was no forced labor, that there was no discrimination of Korean workers. Of course, there can be such testimonies. I'm not saying that the testimonies do not exist, but there were also testimonies made by the Korean workers who were forcefully conscripted to work in those Hashima Island at the age of 14 or 15. You also have testimonies of people who have survived, that there was indeed discrimination and forced labor. And you can also see that there were not just Korean workers at the Hashima Island, there were also Chinese workers and Allied forces POW who also underwent very harsh conditions. There were also child labor, there were women workers. So this also should be included in the history of the Hashima Island. But if you look at the information center, the exhibitions at the information center, there is not a single line about these other types of workers. So can we call this universal value? Can we call this full history? So we believe that the information center should be transformed into a center that fulfills the recommendations made by the UNESCO and lives up to the values that it said it would live up to.
한국, 영어, 일본어로 세계됐습니다만 일본이 메이지 산업혁명 유산을 만약에
So
만든다라면은 적어도 이런 내용들이 들어가
if we were to transform the center, we believe that there's a various contents that need to be added to the presently exhibited displays. And this is a booklet that we made in Korean, Japanese, and also in English, which contains some of the information that we believe should be also exhibited at the information center. So anyway, we had made these translations into various languages, and we had to share that around the world. And hopefully that will also be conveyed to the members of the UNESCO. In 2015, Hideki and I visited Germany, and it's already been 5 years since then. At that time, we raised a lot of issues regarding this aspect, and I heard from some of the officials from the government that it was very welcoming that the members of the civil society were raising these issues. So I think, yes, well, I also believe that the civil society should also take the initiative in raising these issues. So just to look a little bit more into the contents. So there was indeed forced labor of also the Allied POWs. There were Chinese workers. So we also have collected data about how the Allied POWs had undergone very difficult conditions. In the case of Yada steel refinery, actually the founding of the steel mill is very noteworthy because it was built through the compensation money as a result of the Sino-Japanese War. And this kind of steel mill also played a very important role afterwards. And so we also have testimonies from the people who were first forced to work in the steel mill. This is Mr. Choi Jang-seop. He actually visited the coal mine, on the Hashima Island. You can't go to Hashima Island anymore because actually asbestos came out of the remains from the buildings that were destroyed in the typhoon last year. But anyway, he was forcibly recruited instead of his brother. He was just a teenager, and his father was also recruited. So he first worked at the coal mine along with his father. But anyway, his arm was severely injured and had to be amputated. And so he suffered a great ordeal after being forced to work at these sites. So we have so many of these testimonies. And this kind of heritage should become world heritage. And so these stories have to be included in the exhibitions at the Information Center. Only then can it actually gain value as an industrial heritage. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Kim. So the first two presenters outlined the present situation of the information center, the lack of political dialogue. And as an alternative, there was a proposal on how we can transform the Industrial Heritage Information Center as a joint memory center of East Asian countries. So now let's go on to the fourth presentation.
The fourth speaker is Professor Masuno Akisa, who is from the Osaka University, and he is dealing with peace-building issues and also studying the history, researching the history of Northeast Asia. So please, I will hand the microphone over to Professor Masuno Kisa.
Thank you, Chairman. The Industrial Heritage Information Center was opened on June 15. This Sankei News reported on it under the rubric of History War. History war is a term to perceive disputes over history as a war. As it's a war, you distinguish friends and foes, and you mobilize all you have to win the war. The battlefields are comfort women, Nanjing massacre, and wartime drafted workers. The center apparently has become a new tool to fight the history war, this time in the battlefields of wartime drafted workers. When the Japanese delegation stated that they would take measures to address the issue in 2015, there already existed rulings by Japanese courts on wartime drafted workers cases. Some rulings, although the judges did not accept the demands of the plaintiffs for compensation, recognized the facts of forcible recruitment and forced labor. Some cases even achieved settlement, and companies made payments to the victims. There were also studies on the problem. Former Ministry of Education official Mr. Ken Terasaki said that China and Korea's negative reactions to the nomination of the industrial heritage had been well anticipated from the beginning, due to its history of wartime drafted workers. It was not strange, therefore, if the Ministry of Foreign Affairs thought it would be inevitable to include forced mobilization and forced labor in the future exhibits about the Meiji Industrial Revolution. I skipped the second paragraph, the next paragraph. It was Ms. Koko Kato herself, now the director of the center, who conducted interviews with former inhabitants of Hashima Island. In an interview by the Sankei News last year, she criticized the foreign ministry for its too much gentlemanly diplomacy. It was her book, The Industrial Heritage, published in 1999, that became the root of the movement on the industrial heritage in Japan. That's as its subtitle, Historical Voyage Through the Life of the Everyday Man, shows, the book had a focus on the life of ordinary people as well. The author writes, it is important to look at the harsh realities of coal mine workers. She writes about the UK. Examples below are industrial heritage. Each example shows, in a wonderful manner, one face of the British Empire in its Pax Britannica days. What should be specially mentioned here is that they are telling not only the bright side brought by the nobility and inventors, but also the dark side of it to future generations in an objective and vivid manner, not forgetting to look into the life and suffering of laborers who worked hard, covered in black coal dust for bread and cheese. The Japanese society has become mature, but can we transmit the industrial culture with its dark side together to future generations in an appropriate manner? The UK offers us a lot to learn. I skip the next paragraph. Despite of this understanding, Ms. Kato is now playing a key role in the denial campaign as a director of the Industrial Heritage Information Center. Just after the publication of the book, the movement to nominate the industrial heritage started. It started in Kagoshima and spread together to other prefectures in Kyushu. But it was 7 years later, in 2006, when Hagi city of Yamaguchi Prefecture joined the movement. This was an interesting development, as Yamaguchi Prefecture was where Prime Minister Abe had his constituency, and 2006 was the year he became the Prime Minister. Ms. Kato and the governor of Kagoshima visited the mayor of Hagi city and asked him to join the application in that year. The Hagi mayor quickly agreed, and the application was jointly submitted on November 20th. The original title of the application was Sites of Modernization Industrial Heritage in Kyushu and Yamaguchi. The following year, a subtitle, A Pioneer of Modernization in the Non-Western World, was added. Then the title was changed to The Emergence of the Modern State of Japan, Kyushu and Yamaguchi. With this second change, the concept of industrial heritage was gone, and instead, the birth of modern state of Japan was now in the foreground. Kyushu and Yamaguchi were finally dropped in 2015 when the ICOMOS suggested a change. For this trajectory of the title, we understand that the value of the industrial heritage for the movement lied more in its modernization perspective than in the successful transfer of the Industrial Revolution, and that a strong emphasis was laid on the local appeal of Kyushu and Yamaguchi. While it is understandable, as its inscription in the World Heritage List has a direct influence on tourism, the inclusion of a private school in Hagi, Shoka Sonjuku, inevitably added a new certain ideological implication. Yoshida Shoin, who ran the school, was an influential educator and ideologue among the proponents of loyalism and exclusionism in the last days of the Edo period. Shoin thought that the essence of Japan was the rule by a line of emperors unbroken for ages, with its subjects absolutely loyal to the emperor. This notion of centrality of the emperor was later to become the basic principle of the first constitution of Japan. The drafter of the constitution was Hirobumi Ito, Shoin's student, who sought a model in the Prussian constitution. By that time, English-style constitutionalism had been abandoned. Hirobumi became the first prime minister. Shoin also had an expansionist idea. He argued for including the Kamchatka Peninsula in the north, the Korean Peninsula and Manchuria in the west, and the Ryukyus, Taiwan, and the Philippines in the south, into the Japanese sphere of domination. He advocated making the Choson Yi dynasty a Japanese protectorate. For him, to defend Japan, it was necessary to annex these countries. The Japan's major industrial revolution, therefore, represents the awakening of the Japanese regarding defense and the development of the heavy industry to make weapons. But Yoshida Shoin is the symbol of the former line of story with a radical expansionist tone. It is well known that Mr. Shinzo Abe respects Yoshida Shoin. For Mr. Abe, who returned to prime ministership in 2012, the significance of the major industrial revolution had was probably self-evident. In August 2013, the Council of Cultural Affairs of the Agency for Cultural Affairs decided to recommend the churches and Christian heritage in the Nagasaki region as the sole candidate of the year. But usually, the decision of the Council of Cultural Affairs is respected by the government. But in that year, challenging the decision, expert committee of the industrial heritage of the Cabinet Secretariat recommended the sites of Japan's major industrial revolution as the candidate. Between two conflicting recommendations, the Chief Cabinet Secretary chose the industrial heritage. It was a moment that demonstrated the power of Prime Minister. Of course, nothing is wrong if the Prime Minister stands above the ministries in making a final decision as the government. But the industrial heritage continued to be a Prime Minister's project as the Cabinet Secretariat continued to play a central role in the making of the interpretation strategy after 2015. The interpretation strategy the Japanese government presented to the World Heritage Committee in 2017 upheld the vision to transmit the proud memory of transformations in the Meiji area to future generations. This interpretation is far away from what the UNESCO conceives as outstanding universal values. The Cabinet Secretary did not open discussion through the process of making the interpretation strategy. But this is against the principles described in the ICOMOS Charter 2008, especially its sixth principle, to encourage inclusiveness in the interpretation of cultural heritage sites by facilitating the involvement of stakeholders and associated communities. What are missing here are victims and the victim's perspective. The interpretation strategy also failed to incorporate existing studies. Such an attitude is not only insincere, but also procedurally wrong. The Japanese government needs to reconsider the interpretation by allowing all parties involved, including victims and various researchers, to participate in the process. Thank you very much.
네, 고맙습니다. 이 현재 문제가 제기되고 있는 아주 본질적인 부분을 아주 잘 지적해 주신 것 같습니다. 일본이 근대
Yes, thank you very much for that, for pointing out very important points about the Japanese government's attitude towards in the war of history, and how the Japanese government, and thank you for pointing out how the Japanese government is glorifying its industrial revolution and also denying the historical facts about forced labor. And this kind of distortion of history is taking place and is being conducted by the Industrial Heritage Information Center. So those were some very fundamental points that was pointed out by Professor Masuno Akihisa. We'll move on to the next speaker.
교수
And we're going to now invite Professor Lauren Richardson, who's the Director of Studies and Lecturer at the Australian National University. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lauren, and I'm very happy to be joining you today and to be speaking about this important topic. It's also great to see some familiar faces, including Alexis. I look forward to the discussion later. So I'm just going to be sharing my PowerPoint first. Today I plan to talk about the nature of victimization that Koreans experienced. I'll contextualize this in the broader problem of forced labor, because many of the points that I mentioned actually apply to other laborers, not just Koreans too. And I think that when we understand the victimization, we get a sense of why the controversy around these World Heritage sites is very problematic, because the laborers see these sites in a very different way than what Japan does, or the Japanese government. So just to summarize my argument before I start, there was many layers of force and coercion that were used in the recruitment of laborers, and also in their work practices. And these many layers also gave rise or produced many different forms of victimization. And these different forms of victimization also in turn gave rise to many different categories of forced laborer victims today. So just to give a brief recap of the history, I'm sure we've all heard a lot already. During the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Pacific War, the Japanese military used millions of civilians and prisoners of war as forced labor for its construction projects in its occupied territories. Japan's military industrial factories were one of the main sites where they ended up working, but they also worked on projects like the Burma Railway. So in 1937, because Japan was engaged in all-out war with China, it was experiencing a shortage of labor. And so as a matter of national policy, Japan started to aggressively recruit Koreans and Chinese and other workers, and to send them to the Japan home islands and also Sakhalin and various southern territories. So in 1938, a total mobilization law was enacted. And in the following year, 1939, this national conscription came into force. So the forced recruitment of Koreans can be divided into three periods according to the method of recruitment. So the recruitment through private hiring happened from 1939 to 1942. And then there was recruitment through official mediation from 1942 to 1944. And then recruitment through national conscription from 1944 to 1945. And approximately 670,000 Koreans were conscripted into labor in the third stage. And in total, the estimates range from 700,000 to about 2 million. So you get a sense of the huge scale of Korean recruitment. So how were force and coercion exerted against Korean laborers? You kind of get a sense from conservative elements in Japan that force, is very narrowly defined as kidnapping or abducting people from their homes, putting them on a truck and sending them there. But I adopt a much broader understanding of force and coercion and how that was acted against the laborers. So obviously, the colonial power structure was at play, and this meant that many Koreans were already subject to very difficult policies under Japanese colonialism in Japan. Some of them lost their farms. There was also systematic confiscation or strategic confiscation of rice, and this, pushed a lot of people into poverty, and it meant that they were often looking for work and were sort of enticed into labor programs. And there was also, as we know, Japan forced many Koreans, well, all Koreans, to use Japanese language, to adopt Japanese names, and basically to pledge their support for the Japanese emperor and be willing to support these things. So in many ways, they were indoctrinated into supporting Japanese construction projects and the wider imperial expansion. And we also have, in the recruitment process, there was a great deal of deception with regard to where the laborers would be working, what kind of work they would be doing, and the conditions under which they're working. So, for example, there were some people who were told they'll work at a shipyard when in fact they were taken to a coal mine. And once they arrived at their work site, they also experienced a great deal of coercion, compulsion. They were not able to freely choose, to leave their job if they wanted to work somewhere else. They were also basically working extremely long hours with very little food and also with little medical support. And they were working under very heavy surveillance, and they would face brutal punishment in the event that they attempted to escape their work sites. So in many cases, the Japanese companies that they worked for withheld their wages as a way to make them stay, and often only gave them just some pocket money or enough money to survive, with the promise that they would receive the money when they finished working. And as we know, that often was not the case. Many people never received their money. So they also worked under very difficult and dangerous working conditions, particularly in the coal mines. So what was the nature of victimization? There were many layers to this victimization. As mentioned, because they suffered from such terrible work conditions and work long hours, this resulted in many thousands of laborers dying at their work sites from malnutrition, starvation, and also workplace accidents. Their victimization continued even after Japan's defeat, when the Allied occupation of Japan began. So the United States allowed Chinese laborers to return home, but decided to retain some Korean labor in Japanese coal mines. So this resulted in protests and strikes among the Korean laborers who were desperate to be liberated. But American officials responded to these strikes and protests by classifying the Korean laborers as a security threat. The United States then proceeded to collect the wages that were owed to the laborers and put them in a bank account, but then froze the funds because they were not prepared to deal with individual payment claims. And then many of the Korean laborers, when they were finally released, were repatriated, again, under dangerous circumstances. I'm sure many of you have heard about the example of the Ukishima Maru tragedy, when a Japanese naval transport vessel carrying about 4,000 Korean laborers hit a naval mine, and the ship consequently exploded and sunk, killing approximately 524 Koreans. So finally, there were also Korean laborers who had been sent to Karafuto Prefecture, which became occupied by the Soviet Union just before Japan's surrender. And these laborers became stranded after the war when they were refused repatriation to either mainland Japan or the Korean Peninsula. So they became Sakhalin Koreans. So what are the various categories of victims that we now know among the Korean laborers? Firstly, of course, there's those who are seeking unpaid wages and compensation, and we know they've had a very difficult time getting these wages for many reasons, partly because of the 1965 treaty, partly because, you know, funds were frozen in Japan, and partly Japan's unwillingness to impart with those funds. There's also the laborers who remain stranded in Sakhalin or other former occupied territories. They were trapped there, as I said, at the end of the war. They were also stripped of their nationality and denied repatriation. And so therefore they were separated from their families. Their families back in Korea suffered a great deal. Their wives often couldn't remarry. And some of them were not repatriated until decades later. There were also many laborers exposed to the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The US Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, surmised that a vital war plant employing a large number of workers and closely surrounded by workers' houses would be a desirable target for the A-bombs. So part of the reason that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were selected as A-bomb targets is because there were so many military industrial plants there, some of the major ones. So for example, in Nagasaki, the bomb was dropped right in between the Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works in the south and Mitsubishi Urakami Ordnance Works in the north. So as observed by a former American diplomat, this final act of war engendered lasting misery for several thousands of the people the United States was trying to liberate from Japanese domination. And finally, we also have the families of deceased laborers who for many decades or even many years were seeking repatriation of their remains. So many of them waited years to even find out whether their loved ones had died in Japan, and they couldn't move on with their lives. One of the family members who I interviewed, she was a child when her father was taken away as a laborer, and she said to me, I was robbed of my childhood because she spent all those years of the war waiting for her dad to come home, and then finally found out that he'd died in China and that his remains had been enshrined in Yasukuni, which was also very upsetting for her. So these family members are also victims. In a sense, their lives have been really destroyed by the experience of forced labor. So what are the implications of all these different categories of forced labor victims that we have today? It's been very difficult for the forced laborers to form a movement, like a redress movement, like the former comfort women or sex slaves and the Korean atomic bomb victims, where they have a very clear story about what happened. So because of that, it's been very difficult for them to frame how they are victims. As I've showed you today, there are victims in so many ways. They're kind of triple victims, double victims. So it's been difficult for them to present that. And that's partly why this issue has not had a lot of international interest, like the comfort women issue and other issues. They've also had difficulty in establishing who is the culprit. Obviously, the Japanese government is the main culprit because it masterminded this system, this forced labor system. But they also obviously blame the Japanese companies and to some extent the United States as well. And it's also been difficult for them to file class action lawsuits because they all have different wages in different places and different grievances. And so you could say that, yeah, even in the pursuit of redress, there's been a lot of suffering from the laborers in attracting international attention and support. So thank you. I'll finish my presentation there.
예, 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much. Yes, she's been talking about the mobilization, and she's been taking on a very comprehensive perspective. So in Korea, we tend to look at the mobilization as part of colonization, but I think Professor Richardson had given us a more broader perspective. So yes, she has also talked about the different categorizations of the victims, unpaid wages, the level of violence, and also the fact that they were exposed to nuclear atomic bombs, and the fact that their remains were not returned. And so there are various aspects that she has touched upon, and the fact that the remains have not yet returned. And so I also believe that it is also very closely related to our efforts to settle this issue of colonialism. So, okay, so we've had the 5 presentations. We're just going to take a very quick break, and then we're going to listen to the discussants, and then we can also have a cross Q&A. We can also perhaps entertain questions from the floor. So we're running a little bit out of time, but perhaps we can end a little bit late and still take a 10-minute break now. Thank you.
And according to the schedule, we will now move on to the discussion session. There are 6 discussants, designated discussants, and the discussants will be commenting on the 5 presentations that just went before, and also including their own comments about the issue at hand. We will start with Professor Lee Hyun-kyung's presentation. She studied at Cambridge University and has a PhD in Cultural Heritage Studies, and she's now a senior researcher at the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies as a Cultural Heritage at the Cultural Heritage Studies Center. Hello, my name is Hyun-kyung Lee. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very meaningful conference. Since the focus today is on the relationship between Japan and Korea in the context of cultural heritage and collective memory, I would like to focus on Professor Hwang Shu-mei's presentation and focus and offer another example of the Auschwitz as a historical heritage. Safeguarding the past for a better future for all is the short motto that represents or symbolizes the core of the UNESCO World Heritage Program itself. Since World War II, UNESCO was established amidst the ashes of war in order to rebuild the world into a more peaceful place, and the focus was on universalism and cosmopolitanism. And from 1960s, by preserving the heritage of humanity, we wanted to build a golden future for all. And so with the start of a project to move the temple, Abu Simbel Temple, from and prevent it from being flooded and submerged, that project heralded the start of the UNESCO World Heritage project or program since of 1972, and the first 12 artifacts or World Heritages that were listed was in 1978, and since until now, a total of 1,121 UNESCO World Heritage has been listed. But out of these, there's a special case that turned out to be very controversial, and that was the attempt to inscribe in the World Heritage List in 1978 the Auschwitz camps, the forced labor camps in Poland. That was a symbol of the cruelty and barbarism, as well as of the Nazis, and the Nazi Holocaust. And this was nominated. And if you look at the application, it says it applies to the 5th criteria, ideas or beliefs with events or with persons of outstanding historical importance or significance. It was not the outward appearance of the Auschwitz camp, but the ideas and beliefs it represented. And the Polish authorities emphasized 3 aspects. First of all, that the Auschwitz was a place where the Polish people, Jews, were martyred by the Nazis, and secondly, it was a place that symbolizes the resistance that spread across Eastern Europe, and also thirdly, that it was a place where the Jewish massacre occurred from an international point of view. But however, the Auschwitz was not inscribed in 1978. Why did they fail? Was it because of interruptions or intervention from Germany? No. Since 1970s, starting with the kneeling of Prime Minister Willy Brandt at the Jewish Monument Memorial Tower, As you can see, after the war, the Germans have continued to apologize and express their remorse and regret for their past wrongdoings of the Nazis. So it was not the interruption or the opposition of Germany that led to the failure of the Auschwitz being inscribed in the World Heritage. There was a controversy or debate of whether we should be including in the list sites of negative historical value. But although Auschwitz does represent or symbolize negative historical values, it does stand as a material testimony, and that in itself is a positive value, and so it was successfully listed in 1979, the following year, and never again became the motto that led the movement for building a collective memory and sending out to the world a positive and very strong message of peace. So does that mean that any further debate over the collective memory across Europe after the war is something that is too repetitive and time-consuming? And would the message that is being sent out by the Auschwitz being listed, the message of peace, is it too repetitive? No. As you can see, in recent years, there has been a rise in anti-Semitism in the United States, in Germany, and in 2018, there were a total of 1,646 anti-Semitist crimes that were recorded. It was a record. And also the ultra-right-wing party, AFD, also grew exponentially. And there are voices across the United Nations and also in Europe that there were Germans who fell victim because of the attacks by the Allied forces, such as the Dresden bombing. And also, according to a survey in 2017, Germans aged 14 to 16, 40% of them did not even know that the Auschwitz had been set up by the Nazis. As you can see, the Auschwitz is not only a symbol of peace, but a site that has to continue to trigger remorseful or regretful reflection of the past. It should, and in 2019, Merkel visited Auschwitz and said, "No German identity without Auschwitz," saying that we will pledging once again that Germans will not forget the victims or themselves or for the future generation. They will not forget the past or the history for the sake of the victims, for themselves, and for the future generation. And in light of this kind of process that Auschwitz went through in becoming listed, let me compare this now to the efforts by the Japanese government to list the Meiji industrial heritage. As I have explained, when trying to register Auschwitz as a World Heritage, it was not just the national values that were focused on. The emphasis was on a pan-European or pan-Eastern Europe and universal value, and it was recognized, this value, and that was why it was recognized as a World Heritage. And this was in line with the international and cosmopolitan spirit of UNESCO. And so in line with that spirit and those policies, the Japanese government should be focusing on not just the supremacy or the outstanding standards, the outstanding value of the Meiji industrial sites as a national asset, but also you should emphasize those industrial assets and industrial heritage as something of universal value, and it should help people to look at these sites as as a history in their entirety. And to this end, that is what the Industrial Heritage Information Center should be striving for, so that it can spearhead the effort to reflect on the past, on history together as a humanity, and forge the way forward for a more peaceful future. Thank you. Yes, thank you. You have talked about the principle of how something that is a national heritage can become something of that is recognized for its universal positive value of peace, of a more peaceful future. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to the second discussant.
The second discussant is Associate Professor at the University of California, San Diego, Mr. Todd Henry. So he is the author of the book Assimilating Seoul, Japanese Rule on the Politics of Public Space in Colonial Space. And so he is actually an expert in the politics of public space during colonial rule in Korea. As was just introduced, my name is Todd Head. I'm living in Korea right now, so I should be making my presentation in Korean, but I only have 10 minutes, so I'm just going to present in English, which is my mother tongue, not use Korean.
The current impasse over UNESCO sites in Meiji Japan proves that history and memory are extremely important issues. This is especially true for Koreans who over the past 200 years have experienced the pain of imperialism, military occupation, and national division. But this contentious issue and our presence here to discuss it today raises a number of other concerns about how relations between South Korea and Japan have become dangerously locked in state-centered frameworks that make it extremely difficult to establish peace and mutual understanding. These nationalized frameworks, of course, allow governments to promote their own interests and to protest against national interest. But one of the problems that they create in the process is that they do not always offer empowering resources to a diverse set of human actors whom history and memory can, and I would say, should serve. States, of course, and governments have been important and necessary actors in history debates. And earlier we heard the word history wars being used. And this is because states are important actors to seek formal recognition from international organizations such as UNESCO. But one question that I want to think about is what happens when states act on behalf of their citizens, but do so in ways that sidestep other important issues. So as regards present-day South Korea, these issues include growing economic disparities, particular notions of citizenship based on able-bodied people, institutions that remain male-dominated and heterosexist, and ongoing discrimination against ethnic, religious, and other minority peoples at home. In Japan, inconvenient truths about its own exploitation of laborers during the Meiji period, as well as the exploitation of the environment and the catastrophes that have happened to peoples living in Japan, have also been sidelined in favor of a very triumphant story of industrial development. And this is the story that is now embedded in the UNESCO sites. So I am a historian, and so what I'd like to try to offer is my insights about the historical origins of the story that Abe's government has now embedded in public space. And I'd also like, as an American citizen, to point out the complicity of the United States and people who study Japan, who have studied Japan, in creating this story, a triumphant story of Meiji Japan. So now I will go to the next page, page 78, and talk to you a little bit about the knowledge creation of modern Japanese history that we see embedded in the UNESCO sites. So going to the top of page 79. So as regards the Japanese UNESCO sites, and I am not a scholar of heritage like a professor sitting next to me and many others, I not only consider them an affront to Korean national sensibilities, but I also consider them an uncritical reaction to the social effects of capitalism, because we should remember that these industrial sites emerged as a part of global capitalism. So I think we need to consider that process. So I want to offer some viewpoints about marginalized communities in the stories that are being told of quote-unquote successfully industrialized cities. And as I've already suggested, I want to highlight the role of the United States in the post-World War II order in East Asia. The extended occupation of Japan, not only of Japan proper, but also of Okinawa, and the rapid transformation of Japan from a wartime enemy of the United States into an ally, created a kind of alibi for many American scholars during the 50s and 60s and even later, who tended to produce stories of Meiji Japan that were sanitized of empire, that were elitist, that typically told the stories of men who did great things. We heard about Yoshida Shoin, Ito Hirobumi. There's a whole list of these kind of great figures. This was, in fact, a Cold War framework that Americans helped produce and created the story, I think, that Abe has since used as the kind of possibility many decades later to prove to the world that this is a valuable story and should be a story that is somehow universally applicable. Of course, I don't think it is, but I just want to show you the deep origins of the story. The hegemonic view of Meiji as an industrial success that is embedded in the UNESCO sites is familiar to anybody who studies Japanese history in the United States. And Japan, of course, was a place that during the occupation, many Americans went as government officials, as soldiers, as interpreters, as business people. In fact, the first generation of scholars who produced knowledge about Japan went in the capacity of being occupiers. So one only has to read books and articles produced by the first generation of Japanese studies scholars to understand how the Cold War practice of modernization theory and modernization theory picked out of the world Turkey and Japan as successful examples of industrial development under capitalism. This created an image of Meiji Japan as democratic or democratizing, industrializing, and above all, anti-communist. Until the 1970s in the US, social scientists, historians, and other scholars actively embraced this vision, focusing on the male political and business leaders who built the foundations of an industrial Japan. In doing so, the stories minimized questions of imperial expansion and therefore, for a long time, minimized colonial Korean history. It minimized labor exploitation, environmental damage, discrimination against gender and sexual minorities, and other dark stories of modernity. Only during the Vietnam War did a new generation of progressive scholars emerge to debunk these kind of triumphant narratives. In addition to studies of peasant struggles and environmental damage, Marxist-inspired intellectuals suggested that imperialism was central to capitalism. And in fact, if we go back and look at how Meiji industrialism developed, we quickly realize that industrialism was facilitated in the context of imperialist wars. Japan fights China over Korea and takes its indemnities and builds the steel industry that is now being remembered as a UNESCO site. We have other stories, of course, the Boxer Rebellion, the Russo-Japanese War. These are all imperialist wars that show that imperialism and capitalism were tied together. So more than 100 years later, Meiji right-wing successors have now enshrined these UNESCO treasures, but doing so by removing, as we've heard today, the violent effects of not only imperialism, but also capitalism as an intertwined project of both the exploitation of colonial peoples as well as the exploitation of laborers. My point here is to reveal not only the connection of imperialism to capitalism, but also to reveal the complicity of the United States and the way Americans studied Meiji Japan in producing historical narratives that are now embedded in these sites, and much to the protest of many in the South Korean government and many South Korean citizens. So in order to protest these kinds of forms of exploitation, I think it's necessary to remember the triangular relationship between the United States, South Korea, and the US in the context of the Cold War. And that's something I'd like to put on the agenda. So in conclusion, let me just return to my earlier point about the nationalization of history and memory, whether advanced by an oppressive Japan, a resistant South Korea, or a benevolent US. In fact, I find all of these adjectives to describe three countries as problematic. My reservation is not because I consider the UNESCO sites justified in the way they have been created so far, but rather I want to approach them in ways that allow us to better capture the forces that are often lost in state-dominated frameworks about how to remember the past and make use of the past in the present. There are many conflicts, obviously, between South Korea and Japan, and also with the United States. But an exploitative system of militarized capitalism, we should remember, ties all of these states together in a kind of common agenda. And this common agenda is continuing to produce suffering for a number of people that cannot be simply explained as being Korean or Japanese, but need to be considered as individuals who are part of the working class, who are part of gender and sexual minorities, as well as people who are not citizens and can't take advantage of citizen benefits. So it's easy to aim our criticism at Japan, and I'm happy to do that. But I think we should do so in ways that consider the exploitative system of militarized capitalism that's now fully embraced not just by Japan, but also by the US and by South Korea. Given this shared agenda, it's not impossible to imagine that at some point in the near future, the leaders, either government leaders or business leaders of South Korea, may also seek recognition, maybe not from UNESCO, but from some organization, international or national organization, to remember its own miracle on the Han, as many scholars outside of Korea consider South Korea's own economic success. So maybe that might be Pohang, for example, where POSCO is located. Now, I'm not trying to say that the sites of POSCO are the same as Meiji Japan. Meiji Japan's industrialization took place in the context of imperialism. But for several decades, South Korea's leaders' efforts to promote its own economic development has downplayed a number of marginalized groups. Poorly paid women who worked in factories, spinning and weaving, and politically silenced male workers, John Tail and others who protested their government. So in critically responding to these kinds of pasts, I think we should remember not only the connection of militarism to industrialism, but also to remember the role that the US has played in promoting this kind of vision. And so I think that individuals seeking solutions to ongoing suffering that have been caused by interrelated processes of imperialism and militarism and capitalism, as well as patriarchy and racism, should seek various kinds of resources, both financial resources and educational resources, in the promotion of their own interests, which may not fit neatly or perfectly with the interests of states. And so I think it's only if we can find common ground among marginalized groups, for example, marginalized laborers in Japan, in Korea, in the United States, feminist organizations that cross national boundaries, only then I think can we find a way to create the common ground upon which the dark underside of industrial development can be criticized and maybe someday overturned. Thank you.
예, 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much. So yes, we're offline, so I can act as a moderator and keep to the time limit. But thank you so much for. But nonetheless, it was so interesting that you actually went over your time limit, but I didn't stop you nonetheless. Anyway, yes, this is a very very important issue that I'm also very interested in. So how is anti-communism and Cold War have become a barrier to us overcoming colonialism is also a very important issue. So he has also talked about the fact that we need to overcome the state centrism. Korea also has many of the problems that we are raising against Japan. So perhaps taking this as an opportunity, Korea also needs to self-reflect upon some of the issues that we face in our society today. So yes, and also the American society. So there were the US scholars who had contributed to the narrative that we also need to overcome. So now I'd like to now give the mic to Professor Alexis Dudden. Are you there?
Professor Alexis Dudden is a professor of history, especially focusing on the modern history of Korea and Japan, and she is a representative voice in among the historians. And she's a professor of University of Connecticut. And before we get her to speak, maybe I can try to belatedly break the ice by getting all of you to smile and, you know, try to heat up the temperature in this room. Okay, Professor Alexis Dudden, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. It is the middle of the night in Connecticut, and it is nice to see so many familiar faces and meet new colleagues from whom I am learning a lot. Only for this conversation would I wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I want to say that it's very humbling as not just an American, but an American in
예, 저기 기술적인 사고가 생긴 것 같습니다.
I think we have a technical glitch. We're experiencing a technical glitch. We usually blame it on the hackers, but in this case, I don't think we can. It's our fault. It's our technician's fault that Professor Dudden has just suddenly been cut off. I think our Zoom host pressed the wrong button and cut the speaker off. Is that what happened? All right. We have no choice but to spend a bit of time trying to overcome that technical glitch, and we'll have to move on to the next discussant before coming back to Alexis. So because of time, in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next speaker, Professor Nam Gi-jung, who is a professor of the Institute for Japanese Studies at the Seoul National University.
And so he has been very much involved in the ruling regarding the forced labor and coming up with many different alternatives. So I'll give the mic to Professor Nam.
네, 반갑습니다.
Good afternoon, everyone.
메이지 산업시설 산업유산의 세계문화유산 등록을 둘러싼
So I'm going to go over the Korea-Japan relations regarding the Meiji Industrial Revolution site.
워크라고 하는 용어의 해석 문제.
So there is also this contentious issue of the interpretation of the word or the term forced labor or forced to work.
문제의 기원은
So actually that it boils down to the Japan's document. So you can see the document number in my paper there. But anyway, it said that the Japan had said that there were a number of Koreans and others who were brought against their will and forced to work. And so the Korean government said that it was a huge diplomatic achievement that the Japanese government had actually acknowledged forced labor and the forcefulness of the recruitment. But then Japanese government has explained that their terminology was forced to work. It was not forced labor. And their definition of forced to work is not forced labor. And so, and if you look at also the Japanese interpretation or Japanese translations of its speech that was made in the UNESCO, then you can see that the Japanese translations were also is also downplaying the statement that it had made. And so the Japanese government is saying that the Korean government is wrongly interpreting the statement it had made at the UNESCO. So this statement is actually it's not official. It's not included in the official minutes of the UNESCO. But then I believe that we need to check into the exact wording of the Japanese statement, but I was not able to do so on the part of the Korean government. But anyway, so this statement is actually uploaded on the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, although it's not an official document of UNESCO. So I think, first of all, we need to check with the Korean government as to what exactly happened. And we also need to look at the environment or the situation around the negotiation that had taken place in UNESCO. Around about that time, when Japan was trying to inscribe the Meiji industrial sites, there was also a dispute surrounding the comfort woman issue. So we need to look at this side by side. And so between July and August of 2015, it seems that there was a lot of negotiations. So the Japanese government said that it's not going to use the term forced labor. It refuses to use the term forced labor in its official statement. Rather, it opted to use the term forced to work. And so it's sort of like a compromise on the part of the Korean government, because the Korean government apparently agreed to the term forced to work. But if you look at what was actually happening at that time, it's a little bit difficult to understand why the Korean government is said to have compromised, because the Korean government was at an advantage at that time. I think the compromise, or the so-called compromise, is related to the negotiations that were taking place regarding the comfort woman issue. So if you look at page 84, you have my submitted article there. But anyway,
태스크포스의 그 보고서
If you look at the task force report regarding the comfort woman issue,
4차 고위급 협의가 가장 문제가 되는 협의.
it says that the April 11th negotiations was the most problematic, and so a lot of the contentious issues were resolved, and so there were a lot of the agreements made on many of the different issues.
나갔어야 되는데 박제되었던 그런 세 가지가 있었고 여기 추가로
There are
해서
3 different agreements that were made, and there was also a non-disclosed agreement that was made as well. But at that time in Korea,
특히 이제 외교부에서는
especially the Ministry of Foreign Affairs,
그런 사항이기 때문에 이걸 수정하기를
could not accept the
외교부에서는 이거에 더해서 요거를
undisclosed
하고 있던
agreements
상황이었던 것 같습니다. 그렇기 때문에
or proposal for the agreements, and so the Korean government wanted the document to be revised.
어려운 협상을 하고 있었기 때문에
But anyway, the comfort woman issue was at an impasse, and so when it came back to the forced labor issue, I think the Korean government sort of made a compromise and agreed to the term
노동이라고 하는
forced to work instead of forced labor.
성과라고 간주할 수 있는 그러한
But nonetheless,
하는 게 그 당시
the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Korea, nonetheless, even though it did compromise on the term forced labor, it still called the UNESCO statement as an achievement. But nonetheless, the Korea's position on the issue of forced labor became all the more clear after the Supreme Court ruling in October 2019.
그럼에도 불구하고
That indeed there was forceful recruitment and forced labor. And I think we need to move away a little bit from the terminology, because Japan actually made a promise, a pledge to the international community at that time. So it said whether you interpret the term to be forced labor or forced to work, it did acknowledge that Japan is prepared to incorporate appropriate measures into the interpretive strategy to remember the victims, such as the establishment of information center. So it made this kind of pledge. And if Japan does not make an effort to commemorate the victims, and if we are able to confirm that it's coming from a political background, not just a mere mistake, then I think it's grounds for Japan's nomination or Japan's inscription of the Meiji site to be cancelled by the UNESCO. And Korea also made a statement that it trusts the Japanese government to abide by the pledge, abide by the recommendations in good faith. That was why the Korean government at the UNESCO meeting had agreed to the inscription. And so because of these agreements, we need to look into whether the Japanese government's action was indeed violating or not violating the principle of good faith. Let me just move on to what UNESCO implies or signifies in Japan. The UNESCO is very important for the Japanese, because after the war, the UNESCO actually has the mandate to promote pacifism and also peace diplomacy and peace education. And so the establishment of the UNESCO and the joining of Japan to the UNESCO had a special meaning for many of the intellectuals in Japan. And so the Japanese intellectuals, as a follow-up to the membership into UNESCO, also formed groups and issued statements regarding pacifism and the need for peace. And so this is one of the fundamental values that UNESCO holds, and it's also a very important significance that we see in Japan. If you look at this statement that was issued by a group that was formed in Japan after Japan's joining of the UNESCO, it says that the Japanese intellectuals acknowledge the fact that the sense of national pride had also inevitably led to warfare. And the statement also says that we can actually confirm this through historical analysis. Now, in 1998, there was an agreement or joint declaration signed between President Kim Dae-jung and Prime Minister Obuchi of Japan. And this was a declaration that had, for the first time in history, acknowledged colonialization of Korea by Japan. And so Korea-Japan relations presently can be said to be based on the basic principles that are upheld by this 1998 joint declaration. And so if that is indeed the case, then I think the Japanese diplomacy should be turning directions when it comes to the issue of inscribing UNESCO's Industrial Revolution site to the UNESCO. So 1965 agreement between Korea and Japan is just a very technical issue. It does not deal with these fundamental spirits and the fundamental values. Thank you. And so, yes, thank you very much. Once again, he has suggested that we need to think about some of the fundamental values that are embedded in World Heritage. He has also pointed out some of the processes that led up to the inscription of the Meiji site. And he has also pointed out the fact that Japan's diplomacy in Japan is going in the wrongful direction. So, Professor Dudden, we'll have to start once again. You're online now.
Yes, I think so. And I'm going to be very quick in case it disappears. And again, thank you so much for including me. I think listening to Professor Richardson and Professor Matsuno and Professor Huang, the concept of layers is really what we're talking about here. Layers of victimization, layers of listing, layers of battlefields, I find fascinating, and also very historically contingent. And, you know, it's the middle of the night, but if one looks at the headlines today in Japan, the worst thing happening in the world is there's a new comfort woman statue in Korea. And this seems completely out of step, which is just sort of how I wanted to introduce just a few remarks. Because I really take this Professor Richardson's notion of layering here and what it means to be a victim at a certain time in a certain place, and to today be able to look at what the Japanese government wants to celebrate as cultural heritage, which maybe, to use Professor Matsuno's word, should be a different kind of battlefield. You know, maybe Hashima Island should not be seen just as a place of industrial productivity or a James Bond movie, but also as very much a battlefield of contestation, and to pick up on what Todd Henry mentioned, also in terms of the battlefield that is industrial capitalism and its memories and its layering. You know, the notion of UNESCO having negative historical value, or the potentiality of negative historical value, is fascinating and kind of weird, because, you know, how does history have negativity or positivity? It's just sort of there. But that maybe also we could tie into this notion of what the battlefields for modern Japanese memory are. Professor Matsuno mentioned right away the comfort women, Nanjing massacre. And if we look at the Abe government's second term, that is to say, this term since 2012, the first thing that happened was a sort of declaration of war on the Kono statement, on the memory of what had been achieved at that point in Japan. And it struck me as odd in the sense that as a historian, looked at from the year 2012, looked at from the year 2020, comfort women and the Nanjing massacre are sort of equal weights in Japanese history. And so I didn't understand at first. I thought, why is he picking on the comfort women station? Because in 1994, as some of us may have researched, as a young parliamentarian, Abe Shinzo, one of the first things he penned, it has now disappeared from the Diet Library, but he wrote a denial of the Nanjing massacre. So for him, this was a deeper seated issue. Some of us have this document in our offices, which I guess means I have a state secret in my office. So why pick on the comfort women? Was it because Korea is perceived as a sort of weaker target than China? I talked to my good colleague, Professor Nakano Koichi of Jochi University, and he said, no, it's because Abe Shinzo wants to tear down the Asahi Shimbun. And he wants to tear down freedom of speech, he wants to tear down freedom of discussion. And so to target the comfort women object as an object of history, as a battlefield of history, is an easier way to gain Japanese collective momentum against history than Nanjing, which is just enormous. And I've thought about that a lot, and I think about that in terms of the UNESCO heritage sites. I think about that especially in terms of how Hashima Island is able to be celebrated as a place where people had to work instead of were forced laborers, among all of the other forced labor sites in Japan. And I guess I also would like to compliment Professor Matsuno's notice of how Kato is using this notion of an ordinary Japanese experience, because that can be easily, if we look at how that ordinary Japanese experience would pair with the work of Mizuki Shigeru, the very famous manga artist in Japan, who wrote this fabulous series talking about the ordinary Japanese experience in empire and war, we can really see the two elements, or I know that's too binary, but the two elements of Japan in contestation today over how to remember this enormous period of Japanese history, which ties, it doesn't make Japan unique in this at all, and it ties very directly to what's happening around the world, but situated precisely here in the United States with Black Lives Matter movements. We are tearing down statues, we are renaming. All of a sudden, I am sitting in a house that is 300 years old that is on an American Indian burial ground. And I know this, and I speak with the local tribal chair, but my house is a piece of property. Is it a battlefield? Fortunately, I am friends with this man, but it involves the necessity of local conversation, local contestation that, as Todd Henry mentioned, then gets catapulted onto the state level. And so I think my only comment today that could be helpful is really focusing on the layering of victims, the layering of listing, the layering of battlefields as sites of memory ties into what Professor Nam just finished with, which is the very battlefield of the 1965 treaty, which is authorized, backed up, authenticated by the force of the United States through to this day, which is so out of step with contemporary international law. In 1965, the victims were not allowed participation. And we saw a sort of half attempt at reinvigorating 1965 in the very poorly conceived 2015 so-called Comfort Woman Agreement, which again would sideline victims' voices. But we know perfectly well from the actions, especially beginning this entire year, basically, and if COVID had not eclipsed our discussion, we would be now talking about really where we are in forced labor issues between Japan and Korea. But 1965 was international law at the time, and it is not international law today. And UNESCO does not have to uphold the same standards for its heritage sites as they were initially conceived. And so again, just this focus on layering the layers of history, the layers of victimization and contestation are really what we can see at play in these heritage sites and the politics. And I must say, Professor Huang, I visited Taiwan for the first time 2 years ago. Taiwan has a lot still visible in a way that Saipan still has a lot of relics on display, which it makes Taiwan a particular site of contestation. And I'll close very quickly now. I think it was today, forgive me, today, yesterday, tomorrow, this morning's Asahi Shimbun or yesterday's Asahi Shimbun had a really interesting story about a man in Chiba who has in his yard, on his property, a hangar for a wartime military plane. And it's part of the Asahi Shimbun's 75th anniversary of the end of the war. There's the same hangar on Jeju Island. And, you know, sort of connecting these sites of the war, of the relics of war and of empire, I think are also something that we can do. And thank you for letting me participate. Can I say good night soon? I'll stay.
예, 새벽 2시니까 굿나잇 하시는 게.
All right, I think we can allow you to say goodnight since it's 2 a.m. over there. Unless there are any panelists who want to ask Alexis any questions. If not, then we'll send her to bed.
예, 그러면 지금 다른 질문이 특별히 없기 때문에.
Also, since there are no questions directed to Alexis, then maybe we can say goodnight to her. Yes, Professor Alexis Dudden has pointed out the many layers that are present in a battlefield, and these layers accumulate with time, and also the not so visible direction that the Japanese government is taking as a nation in building history and in the history war. And we'll now move on to the next speaker, next discussant, who is Professor Han Hye-in. Han Hye-in from the Asia Peace and History Institute. Ms. Han Hye-in, Dr. Han Hye-in has a PhD in historical regional culture studies, has studied the modern history of Japan, and studied in Hokkaido University as well. So I'll hand over the floor to her. As introduced, my name is Han Hye-in. I would like to thank all the speakers and discussants who went before me. I worked as a coordinator for the Asia Peace and History Institute that was the organizer of this event. Thank you for responding to our last-minute calls for participation and paper submissions. So we've been taking a broad as well as in-depth view of this issue at hand, and you have provided us with very rich details. And my participation or contribution to this discussion would be focusing on how we can move forward in this issue of the forced labor. Professor Masuno has talked about how we should be taking a more critical reflection or critical view of this Japanese Meiji industrial and also pointed out that Shoka Shonjuku should be one of the points of focus. But as I don't know if the reporter beside me, Mr. Kim Yoon-hyung, remembers, but this was too complicated a historical track to write up as an article and get the everyday reader to understand. But then this this did end up becoming a very crucial factor or variable in this history war. The private school Shoka Shonjuku, where all the imperialists as well as expansionists were born and bred, and so it propelled and mobilized people for this history war. And even within Japanese society, this industrial heritage, there are different views even within Japanese society. The civil society in Japan has been working very hard to get the Japanese people to reflect on its historical wrongdoings, but those efforts could grind to a halt, because if this history war, is won by the people involved in the Industrial Heritage Information Center. So I believe that this campaign or this movement has to focus on solidarity. And so how can we move this movement, propel this movement forward based on solidarity? That is a question I would like to pose to our Japanese speakers, especially Mr. Yano Hideki, and to our other foreign participants. Regarding the listing of this industrial heritage, Meiji industrial heritage, as a world heritage in UNESCO, well, UNESCO does have some principles, operating principles, and if these principles were adhered to, then we wouldn't have this problem in the first place. For example, those who were imprisoned or detained in Siberia, that was the story is told from the victim's point of view. And for example, the Nanjing massacre, it was listed as a World Heritage, but then the Japanese government continued to take issue with that and tried to block it, and so that did not pan out as was hoped for by the Chinese authorities. So in a way, this is a crisis faced by UNESCO, the World Heritage Program itself. So it's a crisis because the principles are breaking down. So how should we be viewing this? That is the question I have for the Korean participants or the speakers who have talked about the UNESCO World Heritage Program and principles. And I also have a question or comment for Professor Lauren Richardson. There is the problem of editing of all these records or historical documents, how they are edited and exhibited publicly or disclosed. I don't need to repeat the facts that we are all familiar with, how so many Koreans as well as Chinese and POWs were forced to work and were driven into forced labor in the Battleship Island and so on. So this is not a problem of just the two countries, Korea and Japan. It is a problem of international collective memory, the collective memory of the world. That is how it should be. This issue should be approached. And as you know, the host of this symposium is the Ministry of Culture in Korea. So my question also goes to you, Professor Richardson. What kind of materials, historical materials or documents, can the Ministry of Culture as well as the researchers in Korea provide to you so that you can teach the Australian students or the students in Australia the right approach to history? And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the program that we run at the Asia Peace and History Institute, where we gather Korean and Japanese youths in a history camp. So it's called the Northeast Asia Youth History Camp. And in 2016, this camp was opened in Hokkaido, and we looked at the Meiji industrial heritage. We took up that issue, and the Korean, Chinese, as well as Japanese youths, young people, they participated in a project of rewriting the commentaries in the Battleship Island, on the Battleship Island, to explain the historical sites. And they said that the coal mines, especially the Japanese students, they said that although the coal mines are a proud history, part of the proud history of industrialization in Japan, we also have to include in it the forced labor that the Koreans and Chinese and Allied forces POWs were subject to as well. And but as you know, from the start, the Abe administration has talked about teaching history not from a national point of view, but from a more international point of view, and not focusing on just the Japanese history, but looking at the history of modern history of Japan in the global context. But actually, that is not what the Japanese government is trying to do at the moment, and what the direction that the Japanese government has set for itself when it comes to teaching history. It runs against the mentality of even the Japanese youngsters and students. So in order to teach history in the proper way in Japan and elsewhere outside Korea, what kind of materials can the Korean authorities provide to you? That is a question I would like to repeat for the overseas participants. And lastly, I would like to offer some practical suggestions about what we can do in order to create or recreate the Meiji industrial heritage as another bridge for peace and a messenger of peace, instead of enlarging or escalating the historical dispute among our two countries. Can you offer some practical suggestions? Yes, thank you very much. You did ask for some practical suggestions, but we will have to push that back to a later occasion. We'll now move on to the last speaker, who has been worrying that he would not be given the time to speak because we've run out of time. So I'll now hand over the microphone to Mr. Kil.
Yes, so Mr. Kil was a correspondent in Japan for the Hankyoreh newspaper, and so he spent some time in Japan writing articles and columns. So let's hear from what Mr. Kil has to say. So I'll be quite brief. And so, yeah, I was actually a reporter on the ground, reporting on what was happening between Korea and Japan. So I'll be very practical. I can only but have a very practical perspective. And so when I was in Tokyo from about 2013 to 2017, I wanted to visit this place called Hagi. And Hagi is like the home ground for the Meiji Industrial Revolution. I also wanted to hook up Shinjuku, and I went there, in fact, and I found that it was just a little shrine. And if you just walk maybe 2 or 3 minutes, there was a house, and there was this old lady who asked me to pay 200 yen, which I did. And then she asked me, where are you from? I said, I'm from Korea. And then there was a moment of silence for about 15 seconds. She didn't know what to say. Anyway, Shoka Shinjuku, as you know, was home to some of the people who were leaders in colonial Korea. so they're the birthplace, and they're the place where the leaders of Japan's colonial elite had been raised. But this was also included in the Meiji Industrial Revolution. So if you look at this inclusion of this particular site, it's not just about industrial development, it's not just about industrialization and the glory of that. It has, I think, more deeper implications. And I think the reason why we are here, we are at this impasse, is not because of some kind of a technical mistake. It's more fundamental. It comes from a fundamental perspective of the Abe government. So what are we going to do about this? I don't think calling for the cancellation or delisting is possible. So I looked up, and it seems that there's operational guideline about the World Heritage. And so if a relic or if a site to be delisted from the World Heritage, it has to be physically destroyed, or it has to get the 2/3 of the votes of the membership. And so I don't think it's possible to get the delisting of the Meiji industrial site. In 2017, regarding the Comfort Woman, we wanted the Memory of the World inscription. But you know that now the biggest financial contributor used to be the United States, but now is China, and the second is Japan. And so Japan used its position as the second biggest financial contributor to the UNESCO to block the inscription of the Memory of the World for the Comfort Woman documents. And so if Korea and Japan were to fight with one another at the UNESCO, what do you think will happen? Nobody will side, the countries would not want to side with either one of the countries. And so it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be easy, so I don't think we should start in the first place. I don't think we need to start on the road to trying to get the delisting of the site. I don't think it's possible. And actually, we need to focus a little bit on the information center. There's actually a lot of criticism about the information center even within Japan. The Japanese reporters are not neutral either. So there was one newspaper, I think there was a column in a Japanese newspaper, that acknowledged that there was forced labor, and the fact was documented, and you can check this in the official Japanese documents. And so the column goes on to criticize the Industrial Heritage Information Center that had recently opened. The newspaper had actually criticized that the information center should have been more comprehensive in its perspective. And you also have some journalists within Japan, Japanese independent journalists, who wrote a book about the Battleship Island. And this journalist had said that the exhibition have actually lost its essential raison d'être. And so, yes, we are making just requests. We're not being observed, and people in Japan know this. So I don't think we need to be too impatient. Abe's government is not going to be there forever, and of course we don't know who's going to come in after Abe, but his term is going to end quite soon. So I think we can be patient. I don't think waging a diplomatic war within UNESCO is going to work. It's going to be too much of a pain, and we're not going to win the war anyway. So I think we need to focus on the explanations in the information center. So yes, he has said that we need to be a little bit more patient. We need to have a longer term view and try to come up with an alternative direction for the information center. So yes, we have heard from all the presenters and also the discussants. So if there have actually been some questions, but we don't have a lot of time, so we can't entertain all of the questions. But I think first of all, we can give the opportunity to those who are participating from outside of Korea online. So if you have any questions to any of the presenters or other discussants, those of you who are on Zoom can go first. So who would like to go first? Mr. Matsuno, do you have anything that you would like to ask or comment on?
Yes, thank you. My name is Matsuno. Can I speak in Japanese, please? Thank you. Many people have commented on that private school, Shoka Shunjuku. And within Japan, when we think about the Meiji industrial heritage, this is a very important point. Apart from the issue of forced labor, the leitmotif of the historical stance of Japan, this is led by and spearheaded by Shoka Shunjuku. And as was mentioned, Prime Minister Abe is actually leading this ideological warfare, and many people believe, or at least hope, that his term, Abe's term will end by the end of this year, and a new prime minister will emerge. So we should take a long-term stance and in approaching this issue. And also this Shoka Shunjuku, this issue is something that we have to keep in mind, and also the problems of the Meiji industrial heritage effort or campaign that the Japanese government has taken up. This will continue, whoever the prime minister is, but so we need to focus on taking a critical standpoint in the Shoka Shunjuku, in the Meiji industrial heritage campaign, because it does not have much outstanding universal value. It is only a outstanding national value from the perspective of Japan. I don't know how much of this will get across as I'm speaking as a Japanese, but I don't think it even gets into the spirit of it does not even have much positive national value even. Because within that period, you have the annexation of Korea by Japan and all these other historical facts that should be included in this period. Yes, Mr. Yano, since we see each other so frequently, maybe you may not take the advantage of this speaking.
Yeah. So let me just answer Dr. Han's question. So UNESCO's World Heritage is leading to the attempts of Japan to hide its perpetrator and victim relationship. But anyway, the Information Center denies or does not describe the exploitation of Korean victims. But when it comes to Chinese workers and POWs, there is actually no mention of them at all. So it's not even denial, it's just non-existent. So there's this company, Mitsubishi Material, and it's the company that owned Hashima. And this Mitsubishi Material was actually the target of a class suit by the Japanese workers, and later the dispute was actually settled. And so the company actually acknowledged that there was forced labor, it apologized, and it actually paid compensation to the workers, and the company also said that it's going to commemorate the victims later on as well. So it's something that cannot be denied. And so actually the reason why the Chinese workers were not mentioned at all is because of this agreement that led to the settlement between the company and the workers. And there were also many allied POWs who were working. In the case of POWs, they also raised a class suit, American, a Dutch, a British victim. And so through the San Francisco Peace Treaty, there was a ruling that this issue has already been settled, and so there was no compensation paid out to the former POWs. So the Japanese government did recognize that such forced labor happened, and so it did make an apology to the POWs. And so there was actually an event where the bereaved families were actually invited to Japan. And so that also cannot be hidden. And so that's why the Allied POWs are not mentioned in the information center, but you can't hide it. It's a fact anymore. But from the Abe government's perspective, when it comes to the Korean workers, the situation is different. The Supreme Court ruling has led to a diplomatic tension and dispute. And so the Japanese government felt the need to outright deny this history. And so but because it's such an outright denial, it can become an Achilles heel for Abe and also the director of the center. So I think it's our aim need to be to change the contents of the exhibition. So I also agree to what Mr. Gill has said. Yes, asking for delisting is not going to be realistic. Yes, thank you. So I would like to also give the opportunity to the other international participants who are online through Zoom. Professor Shumei, do you have something you'd like to share?
Professor Huang, you are not connected. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, okay. Thank you so much. I learned a lot from the meeting today. And as a final comment, I would like to respond to the earlier discussion made by the representative from the press. I agree that the end of this meeting is not necessarily delisting, but make it a critical case for us to renew our understanding of the role of World Heritage and the nature of industrial heritage. And I also very much agree with Professor Todd Henry's for recognizing the violence of industrial capitalism, which could have been revealed with this case if more open, diversified, and honest recognition of history and therefore conversation can be enabled. Right after the listing in 2015, actually the then vice chair of ICOMOS, the Japanese experts of heritage, Yukio Nishimura, was invited to Taiwan, and he talked about the achievement of the listing. And I remember clearly in that speech, he shared with us in Taiwan about how it was a uniquely successful cooperation between the state of Japan and all the big corporations like Mitsubishi. Unfortunately, there was no mentioning about the issue of labor, and of course, not to mention about the issue of forced labor of Korean and Chinese and other POWs. So I'm sharing this from my experiences in Taiwan, and I believe this is not only an issue between Korea and Japan, but all of us across border. Thank you.
네, 고맙습니다. 그리고 이
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for pointing out the lack of universality in this surrounding the Industrial Heritage Information Center. The last speaker from abroad, would you like to share something with us?
Yes, Professor Lauren, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. I think the conversation has moved into how should we move forward now with this problem. So I'd like to share some thoughts about what we can do about this problem. And I agree with many of the speakers that we shouldn't delist the site or we shouldn't pursue that. And the reason is that these sites are actually very precious in the sense that many Koreans died there. And in many cases, their remains were not taken to the Buddhist temple. They were just left in these sites. So that's why many Korean laborers, you know, they kind of look at these sites as like a precious graveyard or a cemetery, depending on which country you come from. So they should definitely never be destroyed. And I think in that case, they should be listed. But obviously the problem remains about how to incorporate that history. That's very important. And my feeling is that if Japan doesn't acknowledge, you know, the forced labor and the many, that dark side of the history, then those sites will become kind of like Yasukuni, like they have a very negative international image. They may be popular among some conservatives in Japan, but they'll be very, you know, tainted internationally. And I think the way to resolve this, of course, we should try, you know, to pressure Japan to, you know, incorporate the more dark history, is to work with, I mean, when I was teaching at Keio University for one semester, I was so impressed that some of my students there had been involved in repatriating the remains of Koreans. And during my PhD research, I worked with many activists in Japan. I interviewed them, peace activists, progressive activists, who really care about the Korean colonial legacy. And I think it's important to work with them rather than the Abe government, who's probably not going to be very helpful. And the best way to do this is to just also join forces with the other countries that had forced labor who worked there, and to get all the activists together and really publicize that history, because so many people don't know about this history. I was surprised when I wrote an opinion article about Korean forced labors and how the United States used Korean forced labor. I was shocked that many people in Korea have never heard of that. So I think the emphasis, yeah, I don't think it's going to be helpful to create more of a diplomatic war. I think it's to really create a groundswell of, you know, pressure and to publicize the history. So regardless of whether Japan includes it or not, everyone's going to know what those sites mean. They become like Yasukuni, like an example of whitewashing history and something, you know, quite negative for Japan perspective. So I think, and in terms of what historical sources are useful for teaching about this, I would be very happy to if somebody could send me more kind of testimonies of Korean laborers. I think that's a really powerful way to teach history, even oral history related to Korean forced labor. Obviously, those testimonies are kind of ignored in many cases in Japan among conservatives, but I think that students really like to read this, and I think it's powerful to hear from the laborers what their experiences were. Thank you.
네, 고맙습니다.
Yes, thank you. We've gone way past our scheduled time, and so I think we need to hurry up and wrap up. Although I would love to give other people, the panelists here on the panel, an opportunity to make some last comments. I would like to, I'm very sorry, but I'll have to take that opportunity away from you. And we will have to start wrapping up. A lot of important points have been fielded today, and I think one of the most important things that we have to do, a very important action point, so to speak, would be to publicize these historical facts and our historical perspective as widely as possible, because that would adhere to the principle of outstanding universal value. To prevent the Japanese government from glorifying that Meiji period and the Meiji industrial heritage, and also we need to, that is the duty that we have been given to turn this heritage into something of universal value. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, that has formed a great wall around all of us, and I believe that we still believe in the value of international cooperation and solidarity, and that is something that we should hold dear to our hearts as we move forward. Thank you very much.